Hello Fiona, thanks for taking part in the challenge. And as you can see on the screen, we have your photograph of your third stitch out on a linen type fabric of the bucket of apples design that you chose to do for the challenge. This was an interesting challenge because there was decisions to be made in terms of analysing the graphic, background, foreground, detail, where were you going to start, depending on the size of the design that you were going to do. And of course I've got this on the screen at its actual size. Similarly, this is the design that you digitised here. Let's take a look in true view, and what a nice, neat, great job it looks on the screen. It's apparent that you've analysed this quite carefully as you've worked your way through it, because when we look at how you've been quite methodical in the way in which you've gone around the design. For example, here you decided to do the apples first, and some are in the background and some are in the foreground. You've travelled down the side here to do that. That's the base of the apples. Then you've done this very, very clever little motif to put the dimples in the apples with the green thread, which again runs round and travels down the side of the buckets across to here. Next came your cover in the red, which is a nice graduated fill. Each of these apples is done individually. And then you've put in the leaves here. Just a thought here, you've actually taken the leaves over the top of the apples. One thing that you could have chosen to do is put this stitch first. I know it's a detail, but if you stitch it first, you could have pathed it underneath the apples and managed to cover up those little lines if you'd wanted to. But there's always decisions. There's no rights and wrong ways of doing things. It's got to be what you like. Then comes the manual underlay that you put under the bucket, and then you've worked the bucket in panels, finishing up with the handle, these little filler bits here, the stalks on the apples, and these little twigs down into the leaves. I was pleased to see that you'd also put some thought into using different stitches and stitch angles into the design just to give it some life and some interest. And so of course we've got some different weave patterns. We've got satin stitch, and you've used your little motif maker here for these neat little motifs. Lovely idea to use these little candle wick type things to make the dimples in the apples. So all in all, yes, you've put some thought into this, and I think you should be pleased with what your attempt has achieved so far. Now, you did mention that you'd got two main concerns. One obviously is this gapping here. And there can be several reasons for this, and we're going to look at that in a moment. And the other point that you mentioned was that you actually weren't too happy with the shading. You wanted to try and do what you called accordion shading, but for some reason it didn't work for you. So we'll take a look at that one as well. Now, one of the things that we have to think about when we come to this gapping here is there are several different reasons as to why it might happen. And immediately I saw linen type fabric, and I took a look at this and I had a run through your design. I thought, I wonder, is that a digitising issue with the underlaps and overlaps and pull compensation, which is what you tried to adjust, or might it be something to do with the fabric? And that's something that you can check. And I did by stitching it out on a very fine, tight woven polyester cotton. And in fact, as you can see, my version of your design, I don't have any gapping whatsoever anywhere apart from this tiny little bit here at the side of the apple. I'm sorry, it's not the greatest of photographs. I think the flash washed it out. But this tells me that it wasn't your overlaps and it wasn't your pull comp. Well, not quite. It was a more fundamental issue than that. And I think what you have to bear in mind is when you're dealing with your fabrics, you have to think about the fibres. Now let's just go in and look at this a little bit more closely here. Let's say perhaps take it up just even to 200. And you can see this is what we call a loose weave. It's not tight. The grain is the vertical grain, and then you've got the horizontal grain here, which is the weft going across, and it's quite a loose weave. And in fact, what's happened on your pattern here is the needle's gone down between one of these holes, and its stitch has pulled it this way. Next time it's travelled, instead of actually going into its place, it's got a little bit bigger gap and it pulls across until eventually it's separated out, and then it just becomes more and more intense when we then go up the next panel, which does the same thing, taking it back across. And so of course you get this grinning, and it's more to do with the way in which these fibres are a little bit thicker, and this loose weave, we call it an unstable fabric, and you have to take this into consideration, one, when you're stabilizing it, and two, with your underlay. So let's look at a couple of ways in which we can use underlays to help support and hold in place these fibres when we're dealing with unstable fabrics and loose weave fabrics, and not just relying totally on the stabilizer. So here we have an object. It's a fairly standard weave object. Let's show you the settings that it's working on at the moment. 0.45 for its spacing and a stitch length of 4mm. An edge run underlay together with the tatami as the second run. Now what I want you to watch in the player stitch is that the underlay will go down at 45 degrees to the stitch angle. And just to show you what the stitch angle is on this particular object here, it's 8. So it's fairly horizontal, it's pretty much going across. However, when we actually take it out of true view, I'll just bring it up to 200 so that you can see it a little more. You can see that is the underlay that's under there. I'll run it through the player, and what I want you to notice is how, when this is at 8 degrees and fairly horizontal, the automatic underlay put down by the program is at 45 degrees. In some it can be 90. In some programs you can even set what that angle is. But you need to think about these things when you're dealing with loose weave fabrics. Can you see how it's trapped all those warp and wefts in place before that horizontal stitching goes down? There will still be a little bit of pulling and yanking because it's that way, but there will be far, far less, because this underlay has trapped it. However, of course, we will quite happily go around altering stitch angles, won't we? And let's see what happens when we alter this one here. All of a sudden, you need to have a think about what is happening to that underlay. And if you look on this, all of a sudden, this underlay is pretty much parallel to the warp threads. And it's actually not going to stop these threads being pulled in. Let's see what happens when we play it on the stitch. So we lay down the underlay, and as you can see, that is a perfect recipe for all these stitches here to be yanking this piece in here, and we'll get the grinning, and it's because that underlay is not at a good angle. So it's not a case of don't move your stitch angles around, just be thoughtful when you're working with unstable fabrics and loose weaves that you can have those kind of issues. So that's dealing with the automatic underlay. And then, as Fiona did sometimes, we can put down a manual underlay. We can either put one layer down, or we can put down a mesh or a lattice, as it's sometimes called. So let's have a look and see how we would do that. Now, again, think about this, because you're putting them down as different objects. Think about where is the grain of your fabric, the warp and the weft. The whole point of doing these lattices is that you want to trap the fibres. So of course you don't want them to go horizontal and vertical like the weave. You want them to go across it at an angle, and that's what that one's doing. And then this one's at a slightly different angle in the opposite direction, going across there. And so of course now we have our lattice, and it's well and truly trapped each of these in their rightful position. And when you have a lattice like this, you can pop on your panels on top with your overlaps and underlaps and your different stitch angles on this cover stitching here, but your mesh that you've laid down manually will stay in place. Just something to have a think about. Sometimes these underlays can be quite useful instead of using the automatic ones all the time. Nothing wrong with the automatic underlays, they're very good, but when you're dealing with loose fabrics, just give a little bit of extra thought towards some of these things. So just taking a very quick look back at your underlay that you did, your manual underlay that you put underneath your bucket. Can you see here? It's all vertical, and now you understand why that's not supporting it as much as it possibly could. I'm actually going to show you the stitch angles here. 87, 90, 93. Let's remove those stitch angles. Let's pop that up there, and that's a suggestion that might actually go a little way to reducing some of that gapping by putting down an underlay that's a little bit more supportive of an open weave fabric. So let's move on to the shading issue that you mentioned. I think the effect that you got was actually quite attractive. Perhaps it wasn't what you were looking for, but there's nothing wrong with it. However, let's look and see how it turned out the way that it did, because you were actually looking to use accordion spacing or graduated spacing. I've clicked Control and selected the yellow and the red, and now I'll right click and hide unselected. Now what I want you to watch is the object shapes and also the stitch angles going down. That's a graduated fill on the yellow, again graduated here, deeper at the edges and less in the middle. But then look at the red going on, it's in a completely different angle from the yellow underneath it. Nothing wrong, it's just not what you were aiming for. Now I also did this design, and this is my version of it. As you can see here, my apples are a little bit different. 3 colours, a yellow layer, a green layer and a red layer. This yellow layer looks different from this layer simply because it's also got an underlay underneath it, but if I actually pop that on top, you can see they actually have exactly the same profile, and this one just happens to be a filler in between the two just to bring up that shading. It's just a little bit of a lift inside, trying to get some sort of impressionistic apple. Okay, here we have our object, and there are 2 ways in which you can go about these particular methods, and this one is the automatic method. In Digitizer 5 you are limited to 2 colours when you use the automatic colour blending tool. Still very useful. Select your object, go to Advanced Digitize, Create Colour Blend. Select it. I've chosen purple and green because they're really good for showing contrast, and I want one to have that profile and I want this one to have this profile. I click on OK, and just watch what happens with that bounded box down there. It turns into a green and a purple, and they're grouped together. So let's imagine, look at that and I think, oh, not really that impressed with that. That wasn't quite what I expected. I changed this. I have to ungroup it first. I can right click and press ungroup, or I can select my group and press Ctrl U, and it removes the grouping. And I can then say I want the green one to be profile 1, and I want the purple one to be profile 2, and I have my 2 colour blend with a graduated fill in either direction. Now if I wanted just to have that as a light density piece of work shaded at one end at the other, I could just delete one of these colours, and that's another way in which you can actually take advantage of the tool and make it quite easy for yourself. What you have to remember though now is previously when we started off and it was our blue disc like that, it had an underlay. Now these 2 layers together don't. If I want to add an underlay back to the green layer, I have to go in there and put it in myself. Sometimes you want to put it in, sometimes you don't. It all depends on what stitch pattern and what stitch densities that you're actually using and how much graduated fill that you're using in there. I'll finish part 1 of the video now, and part 2 where we do the manual part of the shading and just look at one other very small issue that you might want to think about, Fiona. So I will be back with you soon.